This week on Talking Politics USA, what next for President Trump, otherwise known as the Daddy? Yes, really. After a big week of wins.
He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Is it surprising that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep Trump on board? I'm not sure.
You should all feel safer now that President Trump can deport all of these gangs.
And that really will cause a little bit of an earthquake, I think, here, as people try and work out how much more power he has.
And is Zohran Mamdani really showing the way for the Democrats?
New Yorkers deserve a mayor that they can see, they can hear, they can even yell at.
Having somebody who cares, who is energized and is looking, to be creative and bold, I think that's something that the Democrats are really, really looking for.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Tom Bradby, and this week I'm joined by Rachel Younger from Washington. Now, in Trump world, of course, there is always a lot of news and much to talk about. So if you missed any of it, here's a summary of the last week.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the doing. Do you understand that?
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. They fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
This is a big win for President Trump because he has been railing against the so-called nationwide injunctions. This is the power of a single judge to block an executive order for the entire country.
You should all feel safer now that President Trump can deport all of these gangs, and not one district court judge can think they're an emperor over this administration.
Rachel, of course, you've just flown in. Dan is off on holiday. You've filling in for Dan for the umpteenth time. Spent a lot of time in America. The Rutte comments. I don't think I've ever seen it. I know we always say this about Trump. We've never seen anything like it. And it is absolutely true. And Robert and I have been talking a lot over the last year, really, about Keir Starmer back here and his utter inability, it would seem, to most of the time say what he thinks. And how at odds it is, really, with a lot of the politics we're seeing elsewhere in the world, where leaders say what they think, and you might not like what they think, but there is something refreshing to think, well, at least that's what he or she, the politician, does actually think about this issue. Trump, of course, it's been one of his signature things ever since the start, that he shoots from the hip and says what he thinks. But I'm interested, when you look at the likes of Rutte and the sort of crawling, fawning sycophancy, which I've just never witnessed anything like that from the head of NATO. It was absolutely bizarre to see. But I guess the big question is, does it work? On the one hand, you've got the likes of him, and Keir Starmer obviously hasn't gone that far, but he's been fairly, I would say, sycophantic to Donald Trump. And on the other hand, you've got Mark Carney, who's been pretty tough with Trump and said pretty tough things about Trump during his election, obviously won a pretty astounding election victory, and has modified his language and his demeanor in some senses since, but still, retains the desire to occasionally speak truth to power. What's your own assessment about which approach works?
Well, I think first, the stakes couldn't have been more high, could they, for Mark Rutte? It wasn't just Trump that wanted those member states to double their spending on defence. That was also what the Secretary General wanted. And if it's a government's very first duty to protect their people, then this was absolutely critical, wasn't it? So is it surprising that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep Trump on board? I'm not sure. I think there's, amongst many world leaders, been very careful study of what they think works best. And so I think it was instructive that straight away, rather than having a NATO summit that lasted for days, they just had the morning with Trump. That way he couldn't do what he'd done previously and walk out after a few hours, humiliating them. They were working towards his attention span, and that was successful. It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because Rutte was mirroring his language, Trump's own language. We can't forget, can we, that cringeworthy text that he sent praising Dear Donald, as he called him, for essentially winning that Israel-Iran ceasefire, he said he was absolutely happy for that to have been leaked, but it was fairly grim, wasn't it, when it hit the headlines? So this language, well, we've seen Keir Starmer do it, as you say. He again mirrored, I think, Donald Trump's own love of theatrics when he brandished that letter from King Charles out of his pocket, the British Prime Minister inviting Donald Trump to that second state visit. And that absolutely left Donald Trump speechless for a while. Did it work? Well, no, I suppose one of the Prime Minister's main concerns at that time was to make sure that the US didn't freeze their military aid to Ukraine. A few weeks later, they did just that. So I think it's tricky. We saw Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, talking about making the West great again, echoing Donald Trump's making America great again. Well, she still hasn't got that state visit that she's wanting from Donald Trump. So it's a tricky one, isn't it? How does it go down with Donald Trump, I think, is my question. You know, this is a man who is speaking to Vladimir Putin, who has held him up as the ultimate strongman, who seems to be drawn to strength and yet enjoys the flattery. As for how those daddy comments went down, just to remind people, I mean, you played it, didn't you, just at the top of the podcast. But what was going on was Mark Rutte was talking about, well, he was describing Iran and Israel using the metaphor of children playing or fighting in a schoolyard who need to be separated. And he said sometimes daddy has to use strong words. It was excruciating. He later said he wasn't referring specifically to Donald Trump, but he knew, of course, that he was echoing the language that the American president had used when he came back to the White House, saying, "Daddy's coming home." So did Donald Trump like it? Well, let's have a listen to how he responded when one reporter asked him what he thought.
Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No? He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Just so you know, because I would imagine you're probably a man who's quite difficult to shop for, one of those people who has everything. The merch immediately went on sale. You can now buy yourself a T-shirt with the president's face on and daddy written in block capitals underneath for the princely sum of just $50.
Let's move on from talking about daddy being home to the Supreme Court. Now, we spent a lot of time debating whether Donald Trump's style of government was fundamentally going to undermine the rule of law in America, and indeed whether it was his absolute intention to do so. What do you make of this Supreme Court ruling? As I said, as I said at the start, as I understand it, it's not really ruling on the question at hand or the question before it, which was over revoking birthright citizenship, which, as I understand it, most opinion polls in America say is deeply unpopular. But maybe, I don't know whether you do or don't agree with that. But this was about effectively restricting the ability of federal judges to interfere in the White House's work, if you like. And as you say, Democrats, view this as a fundamental challenge on the rule of law. What's your own sort of view, having taken a pretty careful look at this, about what it does or does not say about the strength of the rule of law right now in America, and whether it's, we've talked so much about how Congress has ceased to be any kind of meaningful guardrail to the Trump administration and how important the courts are. Therefore, whether you like Mr. Trump's policies or not, there clearly has to be checks and balances in any healthy political system. And many, many people have argued that the courts are the last guardrail at the moment to the White House's apparently untrammeled power. So I guess the question I would really have for you is whether you think this ruling actually does have an impact on that or doesn't.
I think it does. I think he is, and indeed every president of the United States will now be more powerful from this week on than they were from last week. Look, it is complicated, so just bear with me a bit. If you go back to the issue of birthright citizenship, that has been part of the law of the land since just after the Civil War. It's enshrined in the 14th Amendment. And as you say, it's really, really important to many Americans that this great nation, if you are born here, then you are automatically, with very, very few exceptions, a citizen. Now, it doesn't necessarily end that, and this is where we get into the weeds, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but essentially groups of pregnant women, groups that support immigrants will be able to bring class actions that will then work their way through the courts, probably going all the way up to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, that made this ruling. And then once it gets to the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, Trump's Attorney General, who we heard from a little bit earlier, she said she felt it would back what Donald Trump wants to do. And it probably will, because the reality is you've got a Supreme Court that, thanks to Trump's first term, when he appointed 3 right-wing judges, it is now ruling largely in his favor. So what we're seeing now is a shift that gives more importance to the Supreme Court, a court that largely, as I say, has backed Donald Trump because of the way it's made up, but that also simply gives more power to the president. And that's because he, as you know, has been governing by executive order. He's issued a record number of them. And when it comes to things like cutting federal spending for those states that are refusing to put into action his mass deportations, those sanctuary cities, as they're called, well, the lower courts have been able to block some of those. Again, it's a right they've had for more than 200 years. And to use the words of one DC district judge, a judge here in Washington, he said, no president, an American president, is not king, as he blocked something that Donald Trump wanted to do. You can imagine then why Donald Trump was so keen to overturn this. And if you want to really get a picture of how delighted he was, which I think gives you an indication of how important he sees it, he didn't call just one press conference on Friday, he called 2, and there was contentment oozing out of every pore. Yes, he'd had a good week. Yes, he calls many things big victories, but this, he said, was a big, big win, a tremendous win. And the other way I think you gauge how important it will be is to get the reaction from both Democrats, but also those judges on the Supreme Court who are more left-leaning. As one of them said in their writing, which dissented to the overriding judgment, they said, this is an open invitation for the government to bypass the Constitution. I think it's going to be a very interesting few weeks and months as this unfolds, because there will be other ways for states and for the courts to keep delaying the kind of policies Donald Trump might want to put in place, policies that they believe to be unconstitutional. But if in the end they work their way all the way up to the Supreme Court, then he will more often be able to do what he wants, policies that Congress, for example, the Democrats in Congress may believe to be unconstitutional. And then you have to think about who the opposition is, because if there are 3 branches, essentially the executive, Congress, and the judiciary, that are meant to be the balance of power that the founding fathers set this country up to work with, if that begins to shift, then that really will cause a little bit of an earthquake, I think, here, as people try and work out how much more power he has.
For the next part of the show, I'm joined by our Washington producer, Aisha, Kherallah, to discuss the remarkable rise of Zohran Mamdani, the 33-year-old who has just won the primary to become the Democratic candidate to be mayor of New York City. Aisha, can we have a bit of new readers start here? A lot of people may not know what's happened and why. So can you just talk us through who Mamdani is, what's happened, and why you view this as so significant?
Yeah, so Mamdani is an assembly member from Queens, and he's 33 years old. and a self-described democratic socialist. So he's born to pretty well-known parents. His mum's a renowned filmmaker and his dad's an academic. And he was born in Uganda but came to the US when he was 7 and is now a naturalized citizen. And so even though New York is a pretty, considered like a progressive state, he was running on a platform that was considered really left-wing and stuff that even, New York had never seen before in terms of policies, let alone the rest of the US. And it was, he worked to kind of encapsulate using social media and really getting his message across in terms of having these viral moments. But pretty much everybody knew what his policies were going to be, even if they didn't like them. It was rent freeze, free childcare, free buses, and even opening grocery stores. And I think it was a clear economic agenda that he was really pushing, and it's clearly resonated with so many New Yorkers and so many people who have never really come out to vote before.
Aisha, you talk about social media, and I think a lot of people would view him as the part of the generation clearly who, one might call social media natives, people for whom it's second nature almost to communicate effectively that way. What do you think was so notable about what he was doing on social media that allowed him cut through of this kind?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like a truism in politics that if you're internet savvy, then as a politician that you're going to do quite well. And Mamdani's age did come into it. He is a digital native, but I think also he was just really creative in terms of the way that he was going about getting his policies across. So for rent freeze, he would go running into freezing water. He would put out videos in different languages. So he has this video where he's speaking in Urdu and basically using mango lassis to show how the kind of primary election works and how the voting system works. And so a lot of it was entertaining, good picture, and it was always really fast. So there's one incident where he's kind of shouting at Tom Homan, talking about ICE raids in the city. Within an hour, his team had cut that up, put it online, and it just went viral. And, to some extent, he knew exactly who his audience was, and that's how he used social media. So he was going on podcasts like Subway Takes, which is basically where you give your best take and you just sit on the subway. Or he was on kind of other shows like Gaydar, and he also had Hot Girls for Mamdani with people like Emily Ratajkowski. I don't know if you've seen that one, but yeah, he just knew New York, he knew New Yorkers and really spoke to them on the platforms they were. And for me, I find that really interesting because it's not that dissimilar to Trump and what he did with, the manosphere. He was going on all of the kind of right podcasts like Busting with the Boys, Joe Rogan, Theo Von, and they kind of both have used social media to tap into these kind of spaces that already exist in the real world, but have put them virtually and got people who maybe otherwise wouldn't come out to vote for them to vote. And I think beyond talking about, social media as a tactic, that seems to be a very clear strategy that has worked for two really different candidates.
I just want to pick up on the policies, but before we do, maybe we can just have a little reminder of some of his clips so people get a flavor of it.
We have just begun our walk through the entirety of Manhattan. We're at Inwood Hill Park at the tip top. We're outside because New Yorkers deserve a mayor that they can see, they can hear, they can even yell at. We are on the cusp of toppling a political dynasty and delivering a New York everyone can afford. This doesn't show that we will win. It shows that we can. It is so exciting to be a part of that same mission to finally turn the page on the politics of the past.
Go, vote this guy, vote this guy.
Do you make $1 million or more a year?
100% disagree.
So then your taxes are not going up. The only taxes that we are proposing are on the 1% of New Yorkers who make $1 million or more a year.
What are you going to do about the price of matcha lattes?
100% not sure.
Look, Aisha, I guess the big question here is, I mean, we should make clear he's beaten Andrew Cuomo to the Democratic candidacy. Doesn't mean to say he's not the mayor of New York yet, and there'll be plenty of other independents he'll be up against, and there'll be a lot of rich people in New York who may prefer a more centrist candidate or be putting money behind other candidates. So this is far from over. But New York obviously has traditionally been a Democratic city, and he looks like he's got a decent shot at winning it at the very least. And the broader question I think everyone is wrestling with is to what extent this earthquake, if you can call it that, is a sort of blueprint for what might happen in Democratic politics more generally. Are we looking at a much more, Bernie Sanders AOC type candidate, even for the presidential election next time around, because this is where the public are or aren't? And I'm interested to know what you think about that and about his policies, because some of them are, by traditional capitalist standards, or at least centrist capitalist standards, quite radical. Rent freezes, wealth taxes. You've looked at all that, and other people have said, look, the reason people voted for Donald Trump was about the cost of living. It was about kitchen table issues. He spoke most clearly, most effectively about those. That's why he's won. And that's what you need to do to win any election in America at the moment. So I guess my question is, do you think it was just that he spoke most effectively about those kitchen table issues? Or is it an indication that a potentially more radical agenda might serve Democratic politicians more broadly well?
You can't dismiss the fact that he ran on an economic agenda. He ran a campaign that transcended race and ethnicity. But so did Cuomo. He really focused on an economic agenda and, being disparaging to the Democratic Party. So you have both of them coming from that angle, but people look to Mamdani over Cuomo. And I think you can kind of take away from that is, people want to dismiss his policies and say, but he'll never get them through. But I think the question isn't really about whether he's going to get them through. It's the fact that he came with a lot of anger, a lot of irritation, a lot of frustration, and he presented these really big ideas that, whether they're radical in terms of the ideology, they're just creative and different. And I think that is something that really, really, really resonated with people, because especially in New York, rent for a 2-bedroom flat could be $5,500, and the vacancy rate is 1.4%. So it's an absolute minefield. And I was in New York, last week, and talking to different people, some of my friends, some people who also like taxi drivers, and everybody said they were voting for Mamdani, and they were like, I don't know if he's going to win, but I really like what he's doing and I want to support him. And it sounds like he really cares about us. And that currency is something that can maybe hold for other places. New York is different to the rest of America, but that's also what gives it this kind of special angle in terms of being a breeding ground, a place that likes an underdog, a place that's young. So, a lot of people really feel the effects of cost of living. It's not really so clear of whether it can be taken, policy-wise as an approach for the nation. But having somebody who cares, who is energized and is looking, to be creative and bold, I think that's something that the Democrats are really, really looking for right now.
Donald Trump's obviously been very critical and has threatened to withhold funds if Mamdani doesn't, in his words, behave. But do you think in reality Republicans more generally and Donald Trump in particular are a bit worried by Mamdani's rise, or do they see it as, well, if that's the way the Democrats are going to go, that can only help us?
Seeing, the reaction in terms of the media, within the UK, within US, it's really clear that there is an issue in how Mamdani is received and how he is perceived. And Trump calling him a communist, people who are in the MAGA camp, just having this blatant Islamophobia towards him, calling for the next 9/11. There is a lot of vitriol that is going towards him. And you want to be able to say, okay, clearly that's because they actually do see him as a threat and they want to throw things at him. But whether that is going to mean that we're going to start to see some more insidious and racist comments coming out in the run up to November, probably.
One final question to you. I think I'm going to make a massive generalization now, which lots of people watching or listening to this might take great exception to and say it isn't true. But I would make an argument that for Britain and America, certainly, over the last 50 years, on balance, policy and public opinion has been moderately pro-Israeli. Not like necessarily in all cases, for sure, not, necessarily consistently. But if you took the last 50 years, for various reasons, I think you could probably say that is essentially true. And certainly of American public opinion and foreign policy, for sure. And I guess it really interests me. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about Mamdani's, pro-Palestinian views, as people, his critics would see it. It strikes me that it is potentially problematic for Israel in that if you look at the next 50 years, that there could potentially be, because I sometimes look at it and think, I just wonder if this is happening, quite a big underlying shift in youthful opinion about the Israel-Palestine issue. Now, obviously, there's a lot of very loud people on both sides, and that makes it slightly confusing and quite difficult to sometimes understand where the middle is. But watching what's happened in New York, what's your assessment of that? Is there did that play any part in Mamdani's appeal? Is there a shift just analytically, or is that exaggerated?
Yeah, for Mamdani, he has kind of, been encapsulated in a lot of controversy in terms of his stance on Palestine. He declined to condemn the slogan "Globalize the Intifada." Even yesterday on Meet the Press, they were asking him, why he will not condemn this language. And he said, the language that I use and the language that I will continue to use to lead this city is that which speaks clearly to my intent, which is intent grounded in a belief in universal human rights. And it's interesting how deeply the media has latched onto his stance of Palestine. And also, there was this moment in the debates where they asked all of the mayor, like the nominees, where they would go as their first visit if they were to be mayor. And nearly everybody said, I would go to the state of Israel. And Mamdani was the only person who said, I would stay in New York. And so you then also had him going on shows like The Colbert Show, and they really started pressing him about his position on Palestine. And he was on with Brad Lander, who is Jewish, and kind of, they worked as kind of like a coalition together to keep Cuomo out. And he actually said, he came out on their show as well and was in defense of Mamdani and said, no mayor is going to be responsible for what happens in the Middle East. But there's something quite remarkable about a Jewish New Yorker and a Muslim New Yorker coming together to say, hey, here's how we protect all New Yorkers. And in terms of my kind of history of politics, I haven't really seen somewhere where that conversation about Palestine in the US has become such a big issue, where you have somebody who's kind of saying, no, I'm not going to take for this. This is what I said, and this is what I believe, very eloquently as well, and kind of uncompromisingly. So it is interesting to think, he's young, he has a stance on Palestine, and it resonated. So clearly it's not a hindrance. So it's curious whether you're right in terms of that's where people now believe, and that's kind of where the consensus is for young people, because, we have social media and you have all of these spaces where they're seeing things that they don't necessarily agree with their government's policy. And you have a candidate who kind of was an outlier in terms of the rest of them on Palestine. You could argue that, but I think it's difficult to take from his victory that therefore this is a clear change in terms of the opinion of Palestine, because he was also running on an economic agenda that that resonated for a lot of people.
Aisha, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. That's sadly all we have time for this week. Thank you to Rachel and Aisha for being with me this week, and thank you to all of you for listening or watching. Remember, you can watch every episode of Talking Politics on ITVX and YouTube, as well as on your favourite podcast platform. And don't forget to subscribe while you're there. I'll be back with Talking Politics UK with Robert on Wednesday. Until then, though, goodbye.